Kia ora. I'm Murray Jones, and this is a short bonus episode for the history lovers out there. It's not essential to understand the central story we're telling in Heaven's Helpline, but gives a whole lot more context to Mormonism in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which I promise is fascinating. You probably already know that the Mormon faith started in the United States with a fella named Joseph Smith. He was a farmer's son, born in Vermont in 1805 and raised in rural New York State. The early 1800s was a time of great religious enthusiasm and revivalism in the eastern US. So you could take your pick from various flavours of Christianity, as well as strands of what's called folk religion, esoteric practices like folk healing, folk medicines, or divination. Anyway, young Joseph wasn't sure which spiritual path to follow, but then he prayed and had some religious visions that answered that question for him.
I was answered that I must join none of them, for they were all wrong.
Follow none of those faiths. Set up your own instead. By the way, you're hearing clips from some of the Mormon Church's educational film strips from the mid-1960s. The way Smith tells it, he was visited first by God and Jesus, then later by an angel called Moroni. And one night in 1823, Moroni showed Joseph the location of some golden plates that were hidden near his home in New York.
He also said that the fullness of the everlasting gospel was contained in it.
There's a lot more to it, but essentially those plates, believed to resemble a ring binder of metallic gold pages rather than plates you eat off, contain the text of the writings of ancient prophets who had moved from the Middle East in biblical times, around 2000 BC, and travelled to the American continent.
Thou shalt construct a ship, that I may carry thy people across these waters.
So the story goes, Smith translated the plates he claimed to have found, though he later returned them to the angel Moroni, so we can't check his working. And those translations became what's known as the Book of Mormon, which functions as a partner piece to the Old and New Testaments of the regular Bible.
And it came to pass that the people waxed strong in wickedness and abomination.
It's an epic, about 270,000 words all up, and is full of astonishing tales. In the middle, there's the claim that after his crucifixion and resurrection, Jesus himself appeared many times in the Americas. Joseph Smith's new religion was a hit and spread quickly. Individual followers were called saints. The faith itself was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But given the importance of this new Book of Mormon, they called themselves Mormons. A lot of followers headed west, setting up communities in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois. And right from the start, Joseph Smith had a knack of making himself unpopular with those outside the church. Most controversial was his practice of polygamy, men having multiple wives. And if you know one thing about Mormons, it might be that. It wasn't the done thing at the time, and Smith knew it. He married many of his 30-plus wives in secret, either behind his first wife's back, or because his brides were oftentimes already married to other men. In 1844, though, things went horribly wrong for Joseph Smith. He announced he was running for US president, and though it's unlikely he would have won, it raised his profile enough that opponents set up a newspaper criticising his polygamy and leadership. Smith, who was mayor of his town, by the way, ordered the printing press to be destroyed. Things got out of hand, and in the resulting chaos, Smith hired a militia. For this, he was arrested for treason.
Hold it right there, Smith.
And while in jail, a mob stormed in and murdered Joseph Smith. Smith's successor at the head of the Mormon Church was a man called Brigham Young. Young was another pretty keen polygamist. He'd married 56 women by the time he died in 1877. He decided there was so much heat on the church, largely because of its views on polygamy, that they'd be better off outside the United States. So, in 1847, thousands of Mormons joined him in a great relocation.
He gazed at the vast expanse of desert and mountains and declared, "This is the right place."
The right place was Salt Lake Valley in Utah, which at that time was still part of Mexico and occupied by indigenous tribes. The very next year, though, Mexico handed over these territories to the US. It gets complicated around here. Some Mormons fled to other countries, others were jailed, the church split into rival factions, and the Mormon leaders in Utah were still at odds with the United States, which passed anti-polygamy laws. A few decades passed, and Utah Mormons wanted statehood within the United States, but the federal government wasn't happy with the way that Mormon settlers in Utah ran their communities, with almost complete autonomy, and that everything, even the law, was subservient to their religious beliefs. In 1890, the leader of the Mormons was inspired by God to abandon the practice of polygamy, just as the church was being threatened by the government, with the confiscation of their temples and a clampdown on basic civil rights for Mormons. So how does Aotearoa, New Zealand fit into this history? It turns out the Kiwi connection was forged really early on.
It was in 1854 that New Zealand first bade haere mai to missionaries of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
At first, the American missionaries focused on converting Europeans, and there were some wins, but most of these new converts had a habit of heading off to the Promised Land of Utah. In the 1880s, though, missionaries turned their attention towards Maori, and it went incredibly well. In fact, Mormonism was being taken up pretty enthusiastically throughout the Pacific. At this point in New Zealand history, there were loads of churches tussling for the souls of tangata whenua, but they were mostly from Europe. Anglicans, Protestants and Wesleyans from England, Presbyterians from Scotland, Catholics from France. But here were these people carrying the Book of Mormon.
Americans who were just a bit exotic and different from the British missionaries.
That's historian Professor Peter Lynham. Seriously, if there's anything about Aotearoa's religious history that he doesn't know, it's not worth knowing. And Professor Lynham says Mormon missionaries were especially successful in the parts of New Zealand where Maori land loss was the most severe.
These Americans had the very opposite experience from normal colonists who came to New Zealand.
To some Maori, Mormons were a refreshing alternative to the British missionaries who sometimes seem nothing more than the religious wing of the British Crown's land grab.
And so it's quite clear that it's an anti-colonial move by Māori. They're responding to specific abuses and misuse of resources by the Anglican Church. And so there's a very real sense in which it's a protest move.
These American missionaries, they weren't aligned with the Crown. Also, because of the way the Mormon missions worked, with visits of fixed duration, these guys had no real plans to stay in New Zealand. Well, actually, apart from this, there was one sliding doors moment in 1886 when things were getting too hot for Mormons in Utah that a plan was hatched for everyone to flee en masse to New Zealand, where they thought the population would be more friendly to their polygamous ways. According to a report in Wellington's Evening Post, 2 senior Mormons, Elder Doolan and Elder Sorensen, even met with the Waikato leader and second Maori king, Tawhio, with a proposal to buy £500,000 worth of land in the King Country. The paper reported that Tawhio was quite keen on the plan, but the Mormon elders obviously couldn't quite sell it back in Utah. So it shall forever remain a tantalizing historical what if. But the bigger point remains that there was an impressive level of connection between Maori and the Mormon missionaries in this country from early on. And it wasn't purely about land and anti-colonial feeling.
The Book of Mormon was translated here into Te Reo in 1889.
This is Dr. Robert Joseph. He's a law professor at Waikato University and a practicing Mormon. He's Tainui, Tuwharetoa, Ngāti Kahungunu, Rangatane and Ngāi Tahu. Dr. Joseph says Māori appreciated the efforts the Mormon missionaries made with the language.
They came down to the Waikato and they learned to speak Māori here.
In general, says Dr. Joseph, the Mormon missionaries went further than others to meet Māori where they were.
They preached to the people, they kōrero Māori, they lived with the people.
Other things sat comfortably too. Both Mormon and Māori traditions contain similar stories of migrations across great distances under divine guidance. Mormons taught Māori that they were descendants of key figures in the Book of Mormon, and that collectively they were one of the lost tribes of Israel. And yeah, there were some uncomfortable beliefs nestled within those stories, like the fact that, just like the indigenous Americans, their dark skin originated as a curse put upon their ancestors, the Lamanites, and that whiter skin was attainable if Maori took up a more righteous way of living. For Maori, whakapapa, your line of descent from your ancestors and ultimately the gods that preceded them, is central to your cultural and personal identity. Mormons are hugely interested in ancestry too. It ties in with their practice of baptizing the dead. This is the practice not of baptizing corpses, but of a living proxy, baptizing a soul of a dead person into the church. To do that, you need to know their names, which is why the Mormon Church is famous for holding some of the most detailed genealogical records on the planet. And if you've ever used Family Search or Ancestry.com to look up your own family, that's thanks in part to Mormon volunteers digitizing historical records. They also perhaps connected on polygamy, men taking multiple wives. Here in Aotearoa, Māori had a history of being pretty relaxed about plural marriage. And then there were the prophecies. According to Mormon scholars from the 1830s through to the 1880s,
a number of Māori matikite or prophets had prophesied of a new church coming. That's the church for Māori.
One rangatira in the Wairarapa, Paura te Potangaroa of Ngāti Kahungunu and Rangatane, described the tohu, or signs, that would mark this new church.
And he said that the new church will come from the east, where the sun rises.
Well, Americans do come from the east, while European missionaries generally arrive from the west, so check.
They will travel in twos.
Mormons do that. Check.
They'll teach us in our language.
Check.
And he said they will live with our people, they'll eat our food and sleep in our wharis.
Check, check, and check. Whatever the specific reasons, though, the fact is Mormonism became really big in Māoridom. By 1890, about 3,000 Māori, or 1 in every 12, belonged to the Mormon Church. At the same time, though, Mormons bringing the message to New Zealand cities and to Pākehā seemed to have a tougher time of it. There are old newspaper reports from 1901 of Mormon missionaries in Dunedin being heckled and chased by
hooting crowds of about 500 people.
No one was hurt, but the paper does report that the mayor of Dunedin
appealed to them to behave themselves, whereupon he was rushed and his high hat knocked off.
So, Dunedin nightlife, circa 1901. Has anything much changed? Anyway, the thing is, for the longest time, the New Zealand Mormon Church was strongly Māori. And according to Lynham, this means the church here was really quite different from the church back at base in Utah.
The type of Mormonism that developed in New Zealand until the 1940s was in fact a highly untypical Mormonism.
But then, in the 1950s,
quite deliberately, there was a change of policy.
From this time on, leaders back in Utah decided the worldwide church needed to be more uniform, more conservative. This meant that in New Zealand, there'd be less tolerance of traditional Māori practices, such as open caskets at tangi for Mormon members. Whether hui tau or national meetings in Aotearoa used to be held at marae, that changed. The use of te reo Māori was dialed right back as well.
Yeah, there was those challenges about not being able to speak Māori in church, which was a real blow to a lot of our Māori saints, to be frank.
Make no mistake, there was still a uniquely Māori character to the church in New Zealand.
Churches became marae, and the temple became this pinnacle, this place in which family, past, present and future, were all bound together.
This is Dr. Gina Colvin of Ngāti Porou and Ngā Puhi. She grew up in a multi-generational Mormon family. She's a scholar and a public critic of the church, which she's only left very recently.
Because of colonisation, people kind of went away from their homelands. So we lost a sense of our iwi identification.
Gina's talking here about the urban drift in the mid-20th century here in Aotearoa, where over a couple of decades, the vast majority of Māori moved from rural areas to cities looking for work.
And then Mormonism came by and said, that's okay because you're of the tribe of Israel and this is your iwi. And suddenly there was I belong to something.
Many Māori were able to look past the white supremacist subtext in the Book of Mormon and the clearly racist rhetoric coming out of the church at the time, like the fact you couldn't be a priesthood holder if you were black.
And while many Māori here like to say, that was just a black American thing, the underside of that story is actually that made a huge impact. This was the push to whiten the church and to make it look IBM professional. So the suits and tie thing, that never used to be. And it was kind of an evolution of image. These brown people began now act like white people.
By the 1960s, over 60% of the membership of the LDS Church was Māori. Here's how one church leader explained it during a TV interview in 1968 while standing outside Church College.
Why do you have so many Polynesians?
It has something to do with the fact that in the doctrines and the belief of the Mormon Church, we have something that attracts the Maori because of the fact that we can explain his history to him better. We do teach the islander to speak correct English. We teach him industry. A great deal of emphasis is put on good citizenship. We teach a young Polynesian...
Along with the racist paternalism, there were some other religious concepts that, didn't sit easy. Remember the curse of the Lamanites I mentioned earlier? This said that darker-skinned people would get lighter over time if they were faithful to the doctrines.
That by being obedient, we will become a fair and delightsome people.
Here's an interview from 1980 with Church College teacher Maui Whaanga.
I could be called probably dark, but I've married into a line which is 3/4 English, and my children, if I can say this, are certainly fair and delightsome.
So yeah, maybe Mormonism caused a fair bit of internalized racism. Though, to be fair, things got a little better over time. The following year, 1981, the wording in the Book of Mormon changed. Instead of talking about followers becoming fair or white, it says just pure. Through the 1980s, as Māori across Aotearoa began something of a cultural revival, this racist stuff caused some gritted teeth. But in some other ways, the American-style optimism of the LDS Church really did offer something to Māori.
For a while, it was a heyday.
This is Gina again.
So that kind of American relationship with Māori Mormonism was a huge boon in terms of social mobility, the building of confidence, and that swag that Americans have. We can do it. So there was this huge possibility that this partnership between Māori and the LDS Church would raise this amazing generation, according to that American spirit of possibility, to be these enlightened leaders.
Growing up in the 1980s in the church as a
working-class brown kid,
Gina was super aware of the hypocrisies and inconsistencies around identity in the Mormon Church. Gina recalls a time as a child when some American mission presidents visited her church.
I think they were in the jewellery business. And the woman was just dripping with diamonds. You could see them sparkling as she grabbed the podium. And she was busy telling us that, we could be like her if we just kept to the principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We could have all of this. And I just looked at these people who I loved so deeply, working class Pākehā families and Māori families. And I'm thinking, as a 9-year-old, I'm thinking, this doesn't seem right. She shouldn't be here sharing that story. Even at that age, it didn't feel very Christian. White, rich people from America who are dripping with jewels have almost no Christian message to share with brown Indigenous people.
You can maybe hear why Gina's got in trouble with the church over the years. Anyhow, when members asked themselves, am I a Māori Mormon or a Mormon Māori, the answer wasn't easy.
What the church wanted for you was to say that I am a Māori Mormon. And the hierarchy of ideological or theological frameworks, you were supposed to situate the church there with the greatest authority. And your identity as Māori was required to be structured or reconciled around that primary identity as woman.
But as the Māori Renaissance became stronger during the 80s, more began to push back at this idea. Gina tells me about another moment at church in her teens that she remembers well, a conversation at a Relief Society class for women.
My foster mother said to this woman, she said, "Well, of course, Darlene, you're Mormon first before you're Māori." And I remember this beautiful, fierce Māori woman rose up in all of her wehe and her ihi and said, "I am Māori first and I am Mormon next." And I thought it was just glorious.
All those church reforms that started in the 1950s, coupled with a return of Māori language, culture and customs in wider society, eventually led to a change in the membership of the church here.
While there's the striking demographic decline of and ageing of Māori Mormons.
This is historian Peter Lynham again.
There is very, very strikingly the emergence of large numbers of Samoan and Tongan Mormons who are now far and away the most prominent active members of the church.
Just under half the membership of the LDS Church here now is Pacifica people, and that number continues to grow. So it's no coincidence that New Zealand's second temple is being built in what some refer to as the biggest Polynesian city, Manukau, in the south of Auckland. So there you go, Mormon history and Aotearoa 101. If you've listened to this immediately after episode 1, you're now extra ready to get on with episode 2 and rejoin the main story of Heaven's Helpline, the 6-part investigation into the Mormon Church in New Zealand.